Hello, folks. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm going to try and go with my new camera, web camera that I purchased the other day, and I think it's working pretty well. The other night it kept cutting out, and I think that might have been something about the connection I was having at that time than the web camera itself. So this evening we're going to talk about Guantanamo Bay Prison. But I'm going to wait till more people join us. And I said 10 o'clock. It's still 2 minutes before 10. So as soon as I get started, if you could share, that'd be fantastic. I think I have some things to share with folks. Guantanamo is not discussed that much anymore in most circles, but it's still open and operating. So, see, a few people have joined us. Once again, this is Pete Perry, and I'm going to be discussing Guantanamo Bay Prison, that it's still open and operating, even though it's not talked about much anymore in most media circles or even progressive political circles or left-leaning, or within what I call the left-leaning movement. But it's still operating. So thank you for joining me this evening. Once again, my name is Pete Perry, and folks have asked me a little bit about me, a little bit about my background. I try not to make this too much about me, but I'll just say real quick why I live stream is that I think there's very important issues happening in the world today that impact us as left-leaning folks politically, or if we like to call ourselves progressive, things that should be of concern to us and can be rallying points for us to unite together and to fight for. And I think justice is one of those essential causes that brings left-leaning folks and progressive-leaning people together to fight together to make this world a better place, a more equitable place, a more just place. So I just finished a 6-part series on Racism 101 for white folks. And I enjoyed making it. I thought it was extremely important. And I might circle back to some of those issues. Some of you might have just been tuned in to my friend Jacqueline Lukman of Lukman Nation. She does her show Brick by Brick every Thursday at 9 p.m. And I'm thinking about doing every Monday and Thursday at 10 p.m. So I'll be right after her. And she also does this other show. Sometimes her husband, Abdus, shows up in that, Coffee and Politics. That's a good one as well. I mean, they're always good to watch. Jackie just knows her stuff. She knows her history. Very clear explanations. Tonight she talked about racism and why it's difficult, or I don't know, to explain it to white folks to the point where they can understand it or accept it. And she broke down very clearly definitions of racism, definitions of privilege that were very clear and very interesting the way she discussed it this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about Guantanamo Bay Prison Camp, which is still open after 15 years of existence, still open and operating. So with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. So first I'm going to start with a video of James Yee. He was the chaplain in Guantanamo the first 2 or 3 years of its operation. It was opened on January 11, 2002. Hundreds and hundreds of men and boys actually have been taken to Guantanamo Bay. They endured, many of them endured torture. Many of them were held for a very long time with absolutely no criminal charges. There was a period in time when the Bush administration suspended habeas corpus, which is a right to argue against your own detainment. It violated our own Guantanamo Bay, and the way it was operated violated our own 8th Amendment to the U.S. Detention and punishment. It goes against our very foundational values of there should never be punishment before a fair trial. As I said, there's many men there who have been held a long time, have faced no trial. There's many men that have been in and out of there that were never charged with any crime whatsoever. Again, it has been in violation of our own Constitution. It's been in violation of international law. This is fact. So I'm going to start with a video of James Yee, who is a chaplain there, discussing some of his impressions. James Yee was actually, after being chaplain there for a couple of years, he was arrested and charged with 5 crimes, including sedition and aiding the enemy, and was imprisoned there himself for a short while before all charges were dismissed and he was released. He showed sympathy to the men that he was the Islamic chaplain there. He showed sympathy to the men that he was supporting spiritually, and I guess he showed too much support from them. So the U.S. government came after him with some charges, but his presentation here is pretty interesting, so I'm going to start off with that. Here we go.
And what I'd like to do is share with you some of the things that really concerned me, that caused me to raise concerns to the chain of command. It's quite openly known now that Guantanamo Bay has been a location where prisoners have certainly been subjected to treatment that falls within the category of cruel, inhuman, and degrading, and included outrages on personal dignity. As a chaplain in the U.S. military, my first and foremost role was to defend religious rights, religious freedom. And that's what we do in the military. We defend religious freedom. We provide religious accommodations to those who serve the military, to those who may be employed on a military installation, and to those who may be incarcerated or imprisoned by the U.S. military. And certainly that was the situation I was in when I went down to Guantanamo, knowing first and foremost that my role was to provide that religious freedom, provide the religious accommodations for the prisoners in Guantanamo. But going down to Guantanamo, it was immediate that I recognized things weren't right. And let me share with you some of the things that really disturbed me most. In my view, what was most disturbing to me as a chaplain was how I would observe the way religion was being used as a weapon against these prisoners. And because each prisoner was a person of the Muslim faith, it was essentially the use of Islam against these prisoners. In what ways? From desecrating the Quran, the holy book of Islam, a book in which Muslims all over the world consider to be the literal words of God, was used in interrogations, being desecrated, being abused, being disrespected in front of prisoners who sat shackled in their chairs in order to try and elicit response from them or to try and gain information, or what they would call military intelligence from these individuals. Investigations were later carried out into abuses towards the Quran at Guantanamo, and they revealed that Qurans were indeed tossed on the ground, were sat on, or even urinated on by U.S. personnel during the time I was in Guantanamo. And I was very much aware of this, even though I was not part of the intelligence problems with the entire operation, and it was a matter that was discussed back in 2003. This was not made public, or these incidences of abuse towards the Quran were not made public until later in 2005, first by Newsweek magazine. But there were other ways in which religion was being used as a weapon. Another way, U.S. military and U.S. federal interrogators would exploit another aspect of Muslim culture, that which entails separation of the sexes. In a conservative Islamic society, you find the etiquette of men and women separated. In an Islamic center, even here in the United States, you find a place for women to pray, you find a place for the men to pray. You find it different than what we see in this auditorium with men and women sitting together. It was well known by U.S. personnel in Guantanamo, especially in the intelligence arena, that this is an aspect of Muslim culture. And they tried to exploit this when they utilized their female interrogators in a very gross manner. Some of the female interrogators were very ready to conduct an interrogation session of a Muslim male prisoner by herself stripping off her own clothes, standing naked in front of a male prisoner, believing or knowing that perhaps many of these young men, many of these young Muslim men come from conservative Islamic societies, never having been exposed in this manner physically to a woman. They would go further than that and would rub their own bodies, their own personal private areas on these Muslim male prisoners as they sat defenseless, shackled in their chairs. Investigations into abuses of prisoners in Guantanamo even suggest that some of these female interrogators went as far as grabbing the genitals of Muslim male prisoners in the course of interrogating them. All of this was done because they knew it would be humiliating to the prisoner, and these interrogators believed it would help them gain information from the prisoners, or even possibly a confession.
So there we have some of James Yee's recollections of the prison at Guantanamo Bay and the interrogation tactics that were used often by interrogators, primarily U.S. interrogators, but there's stories of British MI5 and even Canadian intelligence interrogators coming down and being part of some of the interrogations, because there were actually quite a few British citizens that were prisoners there, and Canadian citizens that had been prisoner there for a while. One of the youngest men held at Guantanamo Bay was actually a Canadian citizen, and there's been some recent news about him I'll get to in just a minute. Like I said, Guantanamo Bay was opened on January 11th, 2002. Hundreds of men were taken there. Often it was after they were first rendered to black sites run by the CIA in third countries, other countries, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, I'm trying to think there was one site in Poland, and a lot of torture happened in those what's called black sites. And I'm actually going to probably do another live stream where I look at some of those black sites and where they've now been identified. And a lot of the information I'm drawing from this evening was released in, I think, 2014. The Senate Select Intelligence Committee issued a something like around 500 pages report that looks at the black sites, looks at Guantanamo Bay Prison, and all the practices that happened there, including torture. Again, clearly in violation of the Geneva Charter, and clearly in violation of international law, and clearly in violation of our own Constitution, particularly, like I said before, the 8th Amendment, which is a ban on cruel, unusual, inhumane, and degrading treatment of prisoners. So in 2002 it was opened. My activism around this issue started in 2005, and that's also the year that an organization started by the name of Witness Against Torture. I want to give them a big shout out. Witness Against Torture is a great organization. You can learn a lot more if you want to, probably through their website. It's witness.org. And my first arrest protest, because anybody who knows me knows that I do a lot of direct action, nonviolent direct action protests, was on the steps of the Supreme Court building here in the U.S. It was February 2005, the same day that Alberto Gonzalez, the co-writer of what's infamously been known as the torture memo, which provided a quasi-legal reasoning to the Bush administration to conduct torture. And also that winter, 2005, Witness Against Torture did their trip to Guantanamo Bay. They flew into Havana. Many of them got in trouble for doing that because, of course, the ban on travel to Cuba was still in full effect. They marched quite a long ways to the south, from Havana essentially to the southwest corner of Cuba, where Guantanamo Bay is. Guantanamo Bay is not legally the U.S.'s. It's been essentially seized by the U.S. government and occupied for decades now, and that's where this prison is. As I said, hundreds of men, many teenagers have gone through the prison. As of today, there's 41 men who are at the prison. Let me read you some statistics about them. We have 41 men at the prison. I believe 7 of them, let me see. 7 of them have not been charged with any crime. I think a handful of them have been cleared for release, yet are still imprisoned there after many years. There's been case, I think they've been released by now, but in the past there's been men that have been cleared for release for about a decade before they were actually released to their freedom. So again, and there's a series of tribunals that have been set up, but not only about half of those men have even started to go through the tribunal process. There's been very few convictions out of the hundreds of men that have been there. I think it's less than a third of them have actually been convicted. And it's a very gray area. I was at a panel discussion recently that was moderated by my friend Maha Hilal, and I'll show you a video of a presentation Maha did in last year, and she'll discuss Guantanamo, and she'll discuss, in this clip I'm going to use from her speech, she talks about the dehumanization of Muslims. Of course, all the men that have been taken to Guantanamo Bay Prison Camp have been Muslims. Oh, as I was originally going to say, the first couple of years it was open, 2002 and 2003, even a little bit into 2004. Many men were turned over that ended up in Guantanamo were originally turned over by bounty hunters and things like Afghan militias for payment from the U.S. government. So there's been many men that there was no concrete proof that they engaged in any terrorism, any even military action against the U.S. military. They were simply turned over for a bounty, basically. So that's Guantanamo Bay. There's been things such as removal of an eyeball from an individual. Many cases of simulated drownings, that's called waterboarding. There's been rectal feeding because the prisoners there have been so disgusted by their cases not going anywhere, not being heard by anyone, and many of them not even being charged with any crime, that they had went on a hunger strike. And then forced rectal feeding happened that caused physical damage to them and is excruciatingly painful. There's the number: 779 Muslim men have been held at Guantanamo now for during its 15 years, even though only 41 are there right now. 41 of those remain. 5 have been cleared, but haven't been either charged or cleared. Only 7 have been charged in military commissions, and just 3 others have been convicted there. That's the statistic I was looking for. And that comes from an article that my friend Maha Hilal, who is the Michael Ratner was a very important lawyer that was with the Center for Constitutional Rights. She's the Michael Ratner current fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies here in DC. So I'm going to show you a clip of her presentation here. Here we go.
So what I want to do in my talk today is to talk about the theory of dehumanization and identify particular ways that Muslims have been dehumanized in the war on terror. So whenever I start a talk, I usually like to start with a quote. So this quote was said by President Bush in 2006. He said that, quote, "If there's any comparison between the compassion and decency of the American people and the terrorist tactics of extremists, it's flawed logic. It's just, I simply can't accept that. It's unacceptable to think that there's any kind of comparison between the behavior of the United States of America and the action of Islamic extremists who kill innocent women and children to achieve an objective." So from the beginning, we see with this very quote, right, that there is a clear distinction that he is trying to make in terms of the violence that's employed by the United States and the violence that's employed by Muslims. He's trying to make it clear that there's a substantive difference between what the United States does and what these Islamic radicalists, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, does. Right? And so by positioning these two groups in opposition, he's trying to highlight the fact that this group is barbaric, we're not. And no matter what we do, there's never going to be a comparison. It's never going to be a fair comparison because we're inherently more superior. So when I think about the ways that this has manifested itself, I think of some of the opinion polls that have been done in the last 14, 15 years. So in 2014, there was an opinion poll by Washington Post/ABC, and the question was, all in all, do you think the CIA's treatment of suspected terrorists was justified or unjustified? 59% said that it was justified. Okay, which is a huge number. Obviously, we can look at issues of whether or not it was a representative sample, all the methodological issues, but the point is, in this particular sample, of those surveyed said it was justified. And that is a huge number. And think about the question itself, okay? We're no longer asking, is it moral or immoral? Because that doesn't apply to Muslims. We're asking, is it justified, right? Had we asked about it being justified for other populations, we would presumably get something different, depending on who the other population is, of course. But with this specific marginalized population, the question is about justification. And another thing is that the poll asks, they say the CIA's treatment of suspected terrorists. What was that treatment? How would any reasonable person define the treatment that was described in the report. Torture. So when I think more largely about the issue of the dehumanization of Muslims, I referred back to the stages of genocide, which was outlined by an individual named Greg Stanton in 1996. Now, when you bring up the word genocide, it's often thought of as an extreme use of a word to define what is happening now with Muslims. But there's stages, and the important thing is that there's stages. And I also want to mention something very specific about the use of genocide. There was a report by the Physicians for Social Responsibility in 2015, in March of 2015, where they estimated that the death toll in the war on terror between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan was 1.3 million. That's the number of lives that had been lost in the war on terror. And that's an estimate, a low estimate. So think about that in terms of why it makes sense to talk about genocide in the context of the war on terror. So the first step in the stages of genocide is classification. We have this us versus them binary. And that was repeatedly reinforced throughout the language, in particular of President Bush. You're either with us or against us. These people are not like us. Our violence cannot be compared to those of the Muslim extremists. Next step is the idea of symbolization. So there has to be some way of identifying this group, right? Whether you're talking about the Jews, whether you're talking about blacks, etc. There's a way of identifying a group that's being targeted and is on the path to genocide, to being inflicted by genocide, right? So there's this idea of using the Muslim identity. The Muslim identity is used to distinguish this group. Now, the complicating factor for me, when I was thinking about this, is that we often would naturally think that it's about a Muslim's physical appearance, right? In my mind, the physical appearance and the manifestation of violence in terms of their physical appearance is because of the ideology that they are thought to ascribe to. And the ideology of a Muslim is seen as inherently violent. And subscribing to a violent Islam is something that becomes rather genetic. And then the next step is dehumanization, right? So the use of hate propaganda, use of animal metaphors, and again, this ideology that adhering to Islam makes Muslims inferior because Islam is a fundamentally barbaric, dangerous, violent religion.
So there we have my brilliant friend Maha breaking it down for you of, I think how the government justified the illegal, immoral, unconstitutional, outrageous operation of Guantanamo Bay Prison camp. Once you dehumanize a population, you can treat them worse than you would an animal. Now I wanted to get back to that 15-year-old Canadian. I think he was taken to Guantanamo. Actually, no, he was only 13 when he was taken to Guantanamo Bay. Oh, he was 16. Okay, but there have been a few 13-year-olds. Omar Kadir was from Canada. He was 16 when he was taken there. He just recently, last week, had a settlement with an out-of-court settlement with the Canadian government. During his detainment there, actually, Canadian intelligence officials went down and engaged in joint interrogation of Omar with U.S. intelligence officials. And so as of last week, he got a 10.5 million in Canadian dollars, I think, which is what, about 7 or 8 US million dollars, and an official apology from the Canadian government for his treatment in Guantanamo Bay. But let me read through the name of the miners. They were miners when they were taken to Guantanamo Bay Prison. Mohammed Ismail, he was 13. Asad Ullah, he was 13. Nakbi Ullah, he was 14. Muhammad El Garini, he was 15. Muhammad Omar, he was 15. Shams Ullah, he was 15. Omar Kadir, that's who I just mentioned, he was 16. Yusuf Muhammad Mubarak al-Shiri, he was 16. Abdul Samad, he was 16. Abdul Qudus, he was 16. Ibrahim Umar al-Umar, he was 16. Abdul Salam Getan, Talal Zarini, he was 17. Khalid Ramin Hafez, he was 17. And Abd al-Razak, he was 17. So yeah, another man that was a British citizen, actually, very interestingly enough, he was released in Sheikh Amir. He was a very famous detainee because he was there at Guantanamo Bay for 13 years, and he was never officially charged with any crime, and he was a British citizen. He was released, Sheikh Amir was released in September 2015. October, released to Great Britain, October 30th, 2015. So Sheikh Amir was there for quite a long time, 13 years, with no official charge. And the British government was actually demanding his release for many years. And he was one of the ones that was turned over to U.S. military by bounty hunters, those who were seeking payment. And they did receive payment from the U.S. military. Again, no charges, 13 years, gone. He had a wife and children waiting for him back in England. Another thing, when a lot of these folks were first seized and taken extraordinary rendition and often taken to black sites and then eventually ended up in Guantanamo Bay, their loved ones, their families often didn't know where they were for years and years and years until a report came out that they are at Guantanamo Bay. That 15-year-old, the Canadian, I think his family didn't know for a couple years. They didn't know if he was alive or not. He was seized immediately after a firefight, but there was never proven that he took an active part in the firefight. The U.S. claimed that he had lobbed a grenade and ended up killing one of the U.S. Officers, but that was never fully proven in the tribunal. And then, like I mentioned, the torture that went on there, I can read, and this is again from that Senate Select Intelligence Committee report that came out. I'll list 12 of the worst things that happened in Guantanamo Bay. Rectal feeding was used to control prisoners. The CIA claimed that rectal rehydration is a well-acknowledged medical technique. Yes, it was well acknowledged in the 1880s. It was then replaced soon after 1900 by intravenous rehydration. It's not medically effective, and it's very, very painful. In other words, it's torture. The CIA put hummus, nuts, and raisins into a detainee's rectum, clearly to humiliate them, and of course that was very painful. One prisoner froze to death while chained to a concrete floor without pants. Prisoners were forced to stand in stress positions on broken feet and a prosthetic leg. That was common practice. Nearly every man that came in out of Guantanamo Bay were forced to stand in stress positions, and often also that was combined with sensory deprivation where they couldn't hear anything or see anything. There's photos of the men wearing the ear covers and the painted over goggles. That actually that's been studied by psychiatrists. That can actually basically break down your sanity after a period of time with sensory deprivation. Another thing was a prisoner was permanently injured by stress positions. He was somewhat paralyzed, if I remember right. One prisoner had his eye removed. The Senate report doesn't explain how Zubadiah lost his eye. However, he told his lawyers that he woke up one morning to find that his eye had been surgically removed by CIA medical personnel. Interrogators brought high-value suspects close to drowning. Again, a continual, repetitive waterboarding. Detainees were put in diapers or were denied a place to relieve themselves, clearly humiliation. Very cruel and inhumane. CIA interrogators threatened to sexually assault a prisoner's mother. That again goes against international law, the Geneva Convention. Forceful rectal exams, which cause serious injuries. Excessive force was used to conduct these rectal exams, the report states. One prisoner was later diagnosed with chronic hemorrhoids. The CIA's Cobalt prison, that's one of these black sites, was like a dungeon with prisoners kept in total darkness. So that doesn't apply to Guantanamo, but all the other ones did. And so there we are. Those are some of the horrible, horrible things that our country did illegally to a population that they dehumanized. And, you know, many of the men never had official charges brought against them. And so really Guantanamo Bay has been used as a recruiting tool by groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to recruit and to further radicalize some folks. And you can understand how easy that could be. Trump has promised to keep Guantanamo Bay Prison open. And so what we can do to get involved is to sign petitions, go to protests, check out witness.org, that website. That's Witness Against Torture's website. They're a fantastic organization. And so I'm going to wind it up for tonight. Let's see if anybody has any questions or comments that I can respond to real quick. I think I am going to be doing this every Monday and Thursdays at 10 p.m. I think those are good times for me. Let me see. Let's see, is there any? Yeah, it is absolutely vile. And like I said, we violated our own Constitution. I mean, the Bush administration used this flimsy argument that it wasn't on U.S. soil, but some people said that even though Guantanamo Bay was seized illegally, that it counts as U.S. soil. There's supposedly a lease that we pay, I think it's under $500 a year to the government of Cuba, and they've never cashed those checks because they don't recognize that would give legal recognition to the U.S. Seizure and occupation of Guantanamo Bay. And so none of those leasing checks, payments to the Cuban government have ever been cashed. So it's seen as a, you know, it's another example. There's many, many throughout history of American imperialism. And so, you know, that we even have Guantanamo Bay is in the international community widely seen as illegal. So I'm going to end it there. And like I said, check me out Mondays and Thursdays, 10 p.m. I haven't figured out the OBS software. I figured with Facebook, I need to maybe do it on my group page or instead of my wall where it is right now. So I started a group page called Democracy Revolution. So I might move them over there, or I might eventually start live streaming directly to YouTube. Check out my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and check in Pete Perry. You type in Pete Perry and I should be there, and that's where I'm basically archiving all my live streams. Thank you for joining me. Peace out.